Good afternoon. I would like to take a somewhat different perspective on development. I'm going to talk about superdevelopment. Pope John Paul II made a contrast between underdevelopment, which he said is unacceptable, and superdevelopment, which is also in its own way unacceptable. I'd like to develop John Paul's idea today, the idea that superdevelopment or consumerism is a serious barrier to development, because it consumes resources that could otherwise be used for development. Consumerism can be a difficult topic to discuss. I want to illustrate this difficulty with a story from the former Soviet Union. A commissar was inspecting a Soviet plant, somewhat like the one in this picture. He goes up to one of the workers and says to him, "Comrade, if you had two houses, what would you do with them?" The worker replies, "I would give one to the party and keep one for myself." "Very good," the commissar says. "If you had two cars, what would you do?" "I would give one to the party and keep one for myself." "Very good, comrade. If you had two pairs of shoes, what would you do with them?" Silence. The worker doesn't answer. The party boss asks him again, "Comrade, what would you do if you had two pairs of shoes?" Finally, the worker replies, "It's a difficult question," he says. "You see, I already have two pairs of shoes." So consumerism is a hard topic to discuss because it affects all of us personally. Because we already have more than two pairs of shoes, not to mention at least two cars, probably two houses or more, and so on. I've been studying consumerism for some years now, and I always find that it makes me examine my own life. It challenges me. Even while working on this paper just a couple of weeks ago, my daughter left my iPhone out in the rain. One of my first reactions was, "Oh good, I've been looking for an excuse to get a new one, because mine is the older version and I want to upgrade to the one with GPS. Unfortunately, or I should say fortunately, the rain didn't damage it, so I still have my old iPhone." So consumerism is a temptation for all of us, and I think it's more serious than we realize. The Pope defines superdevelopment or consumerism as the condition of an excessive availability of every kind of material goods, which makes us slaves of possession and of immediate gratification. I want to develop this idea of how consumerism is a barrier to development and talk about what we might be able to do about it. Consumerism encourages the consumption of resources that could otherwise be devoted to development. Here's a picture that I think is symbolic of the throwaway culture of the West. I like this picture. If you look at the top right below the flag, there's a little toy Father Christmas of Santa Claus, along with a bear and a duck. It's if they're saying, "We surrender, help, get us out of here." This idea that consumerism is a barrier to development is at least implicit in the quote from Centesimus Annus that is the topic for this panel from paragraph 28, which is all about the special effort to mobilize resources for development, and saying that this special effort will require redefining the priorities and hierarchies of values on the basis of which economic and political choices are made. Our current priorities and hierarchies of values are largely consumerist. We need to change these to free up more resources for development. The Pope makes this claim more explicit in paragraph 52 of the encyclical, where he calls again for a concerted worldwide effort to promote development, and says that this may mean making important changes in established lifestyles in order to limit the waste of environmental and human resources, thus enabling every individual and all the peoples of the earth to have a sufficient share of those resources. So if we had less consumerist lifestyles, we would have more room for generosity and be more able to share resources with those in need, instead of consuming so much of them ourselves. Consumerism is also harmful within developing countries, because there it provides a false idea, a false sense of what development looks like, and ends up misguiding development efforts and wasting resources. This is a point that's been made by the Pontifical Council for Social Communications at least a couple of times. Here's a picture of shoppers in China, in Nanjing, fighting to buy Louis Vuitton handbags. I remember this kind of thing from my own childhood. I was born and raised on the island of Malta, just about 700 kilometers south of us here in Rome. In the 1970s, when I was growing up, we had a GDP per capita somewhere between that of Mexico and Algeria. We weren't particularly a wealthy country. Yet one of the biggest goals for all my friends and I was to have expensive clothing with this picture of a crocodile on it. You see this phenomenon even among poor people in developed nations. Research recent research has shown that poorer people in richer countries tend to spend significantly more of their income proportionately on luxury goods, on cars or jewelry, than richer people do, because they want to seem rich, and this is the idea that they've been given of what success in life looks like. But in addition to being a barrier to development, consumerism is also harmful in itself to those who experience it. There's been extensive psychological research that shows conclusively that people who suffer from consumerism also have lower satisfaction with their lives, greater tendency to compulsive shopping, a higher incidence of depression, and also lower ethical standards. There are many studies on this, lots of evidence. Even more serious than this, though, as John Paul II pointed out, are the spiritual harms of consumerism, where people are led to consider themselves and their lives as a series of sensations to be experienced, rather than as a work to be accomplished. This is particularly concerning in terms of the harm it causes to the family. The health of the family, as we know, is essential to the health of society, because it is there in which man receives his first formative ideas about truth and goodness. Here's a random picture of a typical family. Yes, that is my family. But consumerism causes a person to reject a commitment to enter into a stable relationship with another person and to bring children into the world, or to consider children as one of the many things which an individual can and cannot have according to taste, and which compete with other possibilities. I don't think I need to show you the statistics of declining birth rates throughout the Western world, because you're all familiar with them. But I think it's fair to say that this, at least in part, is a result of consumerism. Here in Rome today, it's worth mentioning that throughout Italy, 60% of all children today, of all Italian children, have no brothers, no sisters, no cousins, no uncles, and no aunts. Important point I want to make here is that when people talk about consumerism, they typically think about it as a threat to the environment. But it's much more serious than that. It's a barrier to development, and it's an attack globally on the most essential part of society, the family. So consumerism is a serious threat. If we want to fight it, it's important to know what causes it. In the secular literature, there are a number of rival theories about what causes consumerism. The first one I'll call the marketing view. This is the view of my colleagues in the academic field of marketing, and also of many of the supporters of the free market. The view is that consumerism is part of human nature, and so whenever human beings achieve prosperity, we get consumerism. So there's really nothing you can do about it. The historical evidence does seem to provide some support for this view. According to historian Peter Stearns, who wrote a book on the topic, basically throughout history, whenever there was prosperity, consumerism arose. Some examples he gives are the Arab warriors of the 10th century, and before that, the later Roman Republic. More recently, with the growth of the free market and the prosperity it has brought, it appears that the extent of consumerism has also grown. So that's the first view, that consumerism is a fact of life, just an unpleasant consequence of prosperity. The second view contradicts the first, and I'll call this the anti-capitalist view. This is the view that consumerism is part of the alienation caused by the structures of capitalism. It's the view held by many contemporary critics of the free market. One example is Naomi Klein, a Canadian author and activist, and her book, No Logo, which is a critique of the global market economy. It's a view also held by the types of people who protest against the World Trade Organization, the WTO. Then we have the third view, which is the evolutionary biology view. According to this view, consumerism is the result of our attempts to prove how fit we are for the evolutionary fight for survival, to prove our health, our strength, or popularity. And we do this apparently in order to attract mates to reproduce with and friends to support us. This view is presented in a very interesting book called Spent, subtitled Sex, Evolution, and Consumer Behavior, by Professor Jeffrey Miller. The book claims that many of the products we buy, particularly luxury products, are really just attempts to signal our evolutionary fitness. So I would buy a Botox cosmetic injection treatment, for example, to signal youth, or I could drive a Hummer to signal strength, for example.